Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of FireDEV, a fireside chat with people in the industry. Today, my guest is Brendan Armstrong. Brendan, how are you doing?
I'm good, mate. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So you work at a little studio called Arrowhead Game Studios as a lead programmer. It's made a game that I think a few gamers may have heard of. Helldivers, too. I mean, congratulations on that, by the way. That it's been an amazing success. Something that I feel like has kind of come out of nowhere. It wasn't really on my radar compared to a Call of Duty or an Uncharted. So congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a hell of a ride getting it to this point.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. So with How Divers, what do you specifically do on that game? And what I would love to ask is, if somebody was to go and play that, what can you say? Oh, I worked on that bit, like that part. That's me.
Okay. Well, when I first joined the team, I wasn't the lead programmer, I was a UI programmer. And so if you look at the heads up display when you're actually fighting in the mission,
Hmm.
I have touched a lot of that. So something that I own from start to finish, for example, is that little kill counter, the kill streak. The little skull, it gets bigger and bigger and redder and tallies up the numbers as you score big multi kills. So that was the actual first piece of code I put into the game, which was kind of fun. Beyond that, like most of the HUD has my fingerprints on it, but it's the nature of the thing when you're working with a big team. Lots of other people have come after me and continued my work, and I was already standing on the shoulders of other people. The other one I'm really proud of is the acquisitions menu. So almost all of the acquisitions menu is like fundamentally like my implementation. So some really tricky stuff like the flipping cards when you're looking through the war bonds, for example, uses some little tricks to like create a really smooth illusion that you're actually flicking through lots of pages when there's only like five in memory at any time.
Okay. And if we talk about the UI for a moment then. So the UI, you worked on that part of it, but how many people at any given time was working on it? Programmers and artists. And is there anyone else beyond programmers and artists that work on the UI at any given time?
It's really primarily UI artists and UI coders. So we would have, well, like say for the HUD, we had a dedicated person, a dedicated UI designer.
Hmm.
Uh, he did all of the designs for that, and then he would pass those to me. Uh, in total, it's varied across the length of the project, but when I started, there was two dedicated UI coders, and by the time we launched, there was I think five, and there's another two UI designers as well as a UI design lead.
Okay. And those designs that you mentioned that the designers will pass over to you, the coders, what in what form do they come? Are they in something like Adobe XD or Figma, Photoshop? Is it in HTML, CSS, or is it something custom?
We actually use Figma, which
Okay.
is pretty common and standard. You also used Figma at previous jobs. It's a very nice way to share a design. It has all these lovely features like being able to hone in on like pixel perfect
Mm,
accuracy, so you can
it
see
is
this
really
part
good.
of the UI is this far away from this square, and it helps you get the alignment perfect.
So with something like Figma, again, I haven't done UI design in the context of getting designs from a designer. Like, I made games like indie games, and where I'm doing a lot of it all myself. So I'm doing designs, and I change them as I need to, then code, and I can change that as I need to. But when you're obviously part of a AAA studio, you're given a UI design in Figma. I've worked on designs, let's say, Adobe XD for a mobile application, not gaming, but like a mobile application. And then when you start implementing it, you see that okay, on Android and then on iOS and then the different other devices within each OS, there's differences. So it becomes more of this design is more of a guideline of overall at the end how it's going to look, and then you make notes of the differences that you had to make, especially when testing occurs. Is that the case with making UIs for video games? Do you get the mock-ups, and sometimes to get it to look the way it does using the numbers in terms of the pixels, in terms of size and positioning, isn't always 100% the same?
Sometimes. So I did do some mobile development for Electronic Arts for a while. and working on the Need for Speed, No Limits. The in that particular setup, the UI designers actually have the ability to do all of their like arrangements of pixels rather than relying on the coders to do it for them. And so what we got in that instance was there'd be an artist who makes the concept, and then a designer would actually implement it. And the editor that they used let them preview what it would look like
Yeah,
in all different aspect ratios, so that they knew exactly what it would look like on every different phone. When it comes to the consoles and PC, we are really only trying to get it done in 16 by 9, although we are adding better ultra wide support soon. But for the most part, everything is given to us in that fixed ratio, and we just implement it assuming that that's the what you're going to see on the screen. And then we have a little bit of magic in the background that will adjust it for slightly different aspect ratios, like 16 by 10, for example.
yeah. And I'm guessing, is there much is there anything that you have to do different to handle 16 by 9 but different resolutions? So 1920 by 1080, 4K, 720, etc. Or not really? Like, how do you handle that, on a big game
So
like this?
yeah, so everything that's designed is always designed in 1080p, so
Okay.
16 by 9, 1080. And then what we do is we have all of our assets have to be double that, so that when it's in 4K, it actually looks correct and there's no scaling. So what we end up with then is if you play the game in 4K, we have all of the double size textures, and the under the hood, it will actually blow up all the textures to double size, which means they're at their original size.
Okay.
But if you play it in 1080p, for example, it will end up shrinking all of the textures. And it's much better to do it like that, obviously, because a shrunk texture looks a lot nicer than a stretched and expanded texture.
Oh yeah, especially a lot of time. Unless you're going super small, then you can start losing detail. But yeah, if you are just going from a matter of 1920 by 1080 to 3840 by to 2160, yeah, I understand what you mean. So to get this correct, you provide one set of images, one set of textures, which are 4K, and then just scale it down programmatically. Is that how it works then? Like some sort of scale factor?
Exactly right.
Okay. And so with designing the game 16 by 9, why ultra wide screen and ultra wide screen monitors and even some other formats have been around for many years now? Like, I remember getting my ultra wide monitor back in 2016. They were relatively new then, but they had been around for a little while. I think that was 32 by 9, I want to say, to 16, or 21 by 9. I think that might have been 21 by 9, actually. Yeah, 21 by 9. And then I remember getting my 49-inch monitor, which was 32 by 9. Yeah, because that's like literally two 27-inch monitors, slapped together. Probably about 3 years ago now. So why, what's the decision behind doing 16 by 9, releasing it, and then bringing ultra wide support later? Because you do see trailers for games coming out, and they're like, we got DLSS, support from the start. We got, ultra wide, ultra, and ultra wide support. We got, these few things. So, what was the decision behind saying, okay, we're going to go 16 by 9, and that's it? And also, if I play that on an ultra wide monitor, do I just get black bars then?
That's a pretty fair question. I'd say there's a few different factors at play. Firstly, the game's been in development for about 8 years.
Hmm.
So back then, ultra wides were not particularly common, and ultra wide support was not something people really thought about.
Yeah.
And it's based on our an engine which is also very old and no longer maintained except by us, called Stingray. And so for every single feature that we would add, such as ultra wide support, we have to actually do that ourselves. We can't rely on, say, people who use Unreal Engine have a much easier time because that sort of stuff is built in from the ground up. So that would be one factor. And then looking at the practical side of it, in the office, we just don't have a bunch of ultra wide screens.
Okay. Yeah, I think the first point is definitely a big one. Yeah, if it has been in development for 8 years, going back to 2016, and like I said, that's when I got my monitor, and it was relatively new then. And like you said, it was still. I remember at the time buying it, and a couple of my friends saying, why did you buy that? It kind of was up, up in the air of, is this going to be the future? Because it was curved, it was ultra wide. Curved TVs were kind of going out then. like they had a bit of a an uplift, but it just didn't work out. But with monitors, that the curved displays have remained, and they've been a great feature of modern monitors, and have ultra wide and ultra wide monitors. Does Helldivers support technologies like ray tracing, DLSS, and also technologies like it's slipped my mind. Let's just focus on those two, and if I remember, I'll bring that one up as well.
Yeah, to my knowledge, it does not. I've looked at the engine a little bit, and there is currently no DLSS support. We would have to add that ourselves.
Okay. And when, because you said the engine's pretty old and the only people maintaining it is yourselves, is it a custom engine that Arrowhead has made? Like, is it fully custom from the ground up, or is it like modified from some other existing engines? And back in 2016, when development started, was that a relatively still modern and newish engine? Hence, making the decision back then to use it, but now it's obviously a bit dated.
Yeah, so it's right. The history of this engine is kind of interesting. It started as something called Bitsquid, and Bitsquid was developed by a Swedish company who were actually quite good mates with the Arrowhead developers, and it made perfect sense to like use this engine at that time because uh, they were neighbors. It worked pretty well for all of the other projects that we used it for, which I believe was Helldivers 1 and I think also the Showdown Effect. Both used the same engine. At some point during its development, it got sold to Autodesk. And then Autodesk made lots of promises that they would continue to support it. At that point, it changed its name to Stingray. And that support eventually dropped off. And so at that point, we were left with the decision: do we keep the engine or do we port to a whole new engine? And the reason that it was never ported mainly is because at every single stage during the journey, we thought we were going to be releasing it very soon. And so the thought of porting the entire thing seemed to be like not a good use of time when you're at the end of the project. With hindsight, it probably could have been a good idea to do a port a long time ago, but it's you don't know that when you're in the position at the time.
Oh yeah, you don't. And so you said just now that there were several moments in the development where it felt like, okay, yeah, the game's gonna come out soon. It's gonna come out soon, but obviously, inevitably, it just kept getting pushed back. What was the main reasons for that? Obviously, looking back, hindsight, clearly it's worked out because the game, it's very well received. A lot of people love it. It's well polished, and again, I think that kind of also goes back into my question of the ultra wide support. Yes, it wasn't released with it, but what was released clearly was a very good game, and then it's going to get added later on. Whereas you do see games where they're promising all these new technologies, but then they fail to maintain 60 frames per second on the highest end, like a $4,000 PC. And at that point, you're like, I don't really care if he has ultra wide support. I can't even maintain a good frame rate. And there's so many titles like that. So what is the main reasons for saying, okay, we're gonna push it back a bit. It's not ready yet.
For the reason that we are absolutely dedicated to the fun. And you kind of see that in all of the design of all Arrowhead games. If it's not quite hitting the fun, if it's not like where we want it to be and hitting our vision, then it's not worth releasing it because it's just going to flop and be lost in a sea of other games that are mediocre and don't do particularly well. The vision for this game was like very, very strong, and it's had a really good, strong core gameplay loop for a very long time. But actually getting to the finish line is it's there's a lot involved, and there's I think a lot more involved than many people at the studio really necessarily anticipated. And I can kind of take you through some of those things, some of the things that make the difference between a big project and maybe like some of the smaller, more indie type projects that were done before.
Yeah, I mean, I would love that. So, if you want to go through them, that'd be great.
Right. So localization is a big one.
Hmm.
Uh, it seems all very easy when you're doing everything in your native language and you're setting up. We're setting up the framework for the localization, but as it gets closer and closer, you realize that you need to start locking things down so that you can send it to translators to actually get the translations done. and there's a turnaround time for that. And when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of lines, we need to be quite cognizant of all of those types of things. And then dealing with the fact that there are lots of different PC configurations that you might not necessarily think of when you're in development means we had to do a lot of sweeps on things like making sure it would be compatible with a huge range of systems that we didn't anticipate, looking for all kinds of things. And obviously, we didn't even quite get there all the way. There have been issues with certain graphics cards and some compatibility problems, but we're working as hard as we can to fix them, obviously. Other things that take much longer than we realize are things like going through legal checks. So it might not be a big problem to poke fun at like other cultural touchstones. Like we could make fun of Call of Duty if we were a tiny indie studio, and it would be fine. But if you're a much bigger game, then it's well, Sony has a bigger target on their back, so you cannot like reference things without violating copyright and generating lawsuits. And we have to be very careful, especially today with the rise of AI, that we have references for everything, so that we can prove that every single piece of artwork that we create is actually original, and we can show which references that we use to build it. All sorts of stuff like that. It's there's quite a few things that go into like a big professional release.
Okay, and you mentioned AI there. Uh, has any AI officially been used in the process of making Helldivers 2?
None officially and none unofficially. It's just something that's like a big hard no for the studio.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of companies and studios, they have drawn the line, at least for now, on, we're not using it. You briefly touched on, the reason or some of the reasons why. What is the main, you know, concern with it? Because there's obviously a lot of talk behind it. There's a lot of money being thrown at it. And I think anyone that uses tools like ChatGPT for any period of time sees the huge advantages for it. I understand with artwork, but what about coding? Or like I've seen some studios where they'll use it for mock-ups, but it'll be as a matter of just trying to conceptualize something really quickly, but then they're using their artists to draw it from scratch afterwards.
Yeah, so I don't really get too much involved in that side of things, but I am aware of the Sony policies. And the Sony policy right now is until things are clearer in terms of the legalities of this stuff, that it's just something that we're not going to even, we're going to tempt the devil, stay away from it until it's all figured out.
Okay, and you just mentioned Sony there. So what's Sony's involvement with Arrowhead? Because Helldivers is on PC, plus it's also on PlayStation 5, and then but it's not on Xbox. So what is Sony's involvement, and have they always been involved in the project?
Well, Sony's the publisher. So Sony has been the publisher also for Helldivers 1, and they own the IP. So they don't own Arrowhead. Arrowhead is an independent studio, and so there is a contract there that Arrowhead works for Sony to develop their IP.
Okay. And, as such, they have, certain guidelines to follow. And one of them is, no use of AI, like I said, until it's clearer what the legality is, of it is. I can you talk about any of the other sort of rules that a publisher like Sony puts on a studio like Arrowhead?
There's nothing really major. It's just things like we have to meet certain accessibility requirements.
Yeah.
We have to meet certain requirements around like use of anyone who's publishing anything on a Sony PlayStation has to follow certain like technical requirements to make sure it hits like a level of quality that's acceptable. And of course, there's all the legal checks. Everything has to be considered legally sound by Sony. And then there'll be things like ratings. So if we're trying to hit a certain rating, we have to comply with ratings that will affect the game in every region that it will be sold. And so we're considering like the different rules in Japan versus America versus parts of Asia. There's quite a wide spread of different things we have to look at. And so Sony is very interested in keeping a really high quality bar. And you can see that in a lot of their releases. The production quality is just, mwah, it's great.
Oh yeah, it is. Like that is the one thing when you get a title come from a studio that is in partnership with a publisher like Sony is they do have strict guidelines, and obviously there's certain things that you can and can't do. But then also, they'll say, okay, it's not quite ready yet, even though the studio may have released it. Sony will say no. And going back to the point before of it getting pushed back because it's not quite there yet. Were some of those instances Sony saying, it needs to be a bit more polished, or was it purely Arrowhead saying, no, we need to keep going?
You know what? That's actually before my time at the studio, so I'm only really aware of one of the circumstances around one pushback, and that pushback was the official release pushback, which was mainly due to the fact that uh, it was about marketing, and that was it. The game was pretty much ready to go, and all that we needed to do was not release it in the middle of October, amongst all of those other huge games that came out last October, and instead February, which was, as it turned out, a much quieter month and probably a really good move.
Oh yeah, and I mean the game was amazing anyway. But yeah, releasing it, outside of that Christmas rush, sometimes can be very beneficial because yeah, if you release a Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed, they're guaranteed to get sales. They could be rubbish and they'll still get the sales. But obviously, something like Helldivers, it turned out it was amazing and it probably would have still done well. But in February, it was a lot less quiet. I'm trying to think what the competition even was in February. It wasn't anything crazy. So yeah,
No, our big competition would be things like Suicide Squad, another cooperative shooter.
yeah.
Final Fantasy VII is obviously like a
Mm,
huge hitter in terms of games and very popular. And that managed to be spaced out by a couple of weeks, which was good.
yeah.
What
Plus,
else was really big?
Suicide
Not
Squad.
much.
I mean, we've seen the reviews. Didn't do as well as Helldivers. Plus, I feel like Final Fantasy, no matter how well they do, they're always. I always feel like okay, it's not either or with Final Fantasy. It's okay. If I like Final Fantasy, I'm gonna get that as well. Like it's always a little, less competitive against them. I feel like in the market, whereas some of the other games, it can be either or for certain gamers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're hitting like a very different kind of experience, and it's a very different market. There's probably some crossover, but I don't imagine that crossover would be like enough to make you choose one or the other.
Yeah, it's not like Battlefield and Call of Duty. If they come out at the same time, there literally will be people who will be like, okay, I'm just buying Call of Duty or I'm just buying Battlefield because all my friends are on it, or I prefer that gameplay. Whereas you're probably not going to get that with Final Fantasy and Helldivers. You may get it in terms of okay, I'll buy this one for now, and then once I've completed it or I've played it a fair bit, I'll buy the other one. But I think it's less of I'm not going to buy it all. I'm more, I will get both if I want both.
Hmm.
So, as lead programmer, you started as a UI programmer there. What was that transition like, and what's the difference in responsibility and role as a lead programmer versus a UI programmer?
Okay, well, I'd been there for about a year, and I'd noticed that there was maybe like a bit of a gap or a need for someone to organize the UI a little bit more and to take charge of the UI team. Uh, it was originally that the entire team was run by a designer, but there's some disadvantages to doing that because the designer doesn't always know how to help the coders. It's a different discipline. And so there was a gap and a space, and I decided to really, I did it by starting to do the role before anyone asked me to, before it was official. I just took charge of looking after people, making sure everyone had what they needed, going to more and more meetings, representing the interests of the coders involved. And at some point, they just made it official and said, "Yep, it's yours."
Okay, I think that's really interesting because I know people listening to this, they will be in a role of thinking, how do I get to that next level? How do I go from junior to mid to senior, to lead, and then to engineer man? All that sort of stuff. Did you, was you doing those extra things with the mindset of this could lead into a bigger and better role, and all, obviously it's good to help the team and help the project, but or there's always an element of how can it value me as well. So was there element of okay, if I do this, I could potentially get into a leadership position? Because it sounds like that position wasn't at that time openly advertised of this is a position we need, but it just kind of came about.
Yeah, so I always wanted to be a lead, and there was definitely like a clear goal involved in this move. It's been the way I've treated most of my career is to, they say you should dress for the job that you want, not for the job that you have. It's that idea. You start behaving and doing the things that represent where you want to be instead of waiting to be given the role or the title. And so, yeah, that was my plan definitely the whole time,
Okay,
and it
so
made sense because like I have a background in like teaching leadership training, so
yeah.
it's not like I came into leadership completely cold.
So, what's the hierarchy of programmers at a studio like Arrowhead? UI programmer, lead programmer. Is there anything in between? Obviously, what's below, and what generally comes above lead programmer?
Well, what we do is very similar to a lot of other studios. There is juniors,
Hmm.
mids, and seniors, and then after you reach senior, you have the option to go principal or lead. Now, a lead is much more people focused and management focused, whereas a principal is much more technical expertise focused. And that's what we do. We don't always have like the opportunity for literally every person to go up to principal because that doesn't really work. It's as you go up the levels of the roles, it becomes based on more of a need than necessarily your qualifications.
Okay, and that makes sense. If you look at any organization, there's always more, usually more at the bottom than there is at the top. There's probably only one CEO, maybe a co-CEO, but like there's one CEO, there'll be a few co-founders, more executive, more management, and it trickles down. So that does make sense. When you was a UI programmer, because you mentioned junior, mid, and senior, and then going to principal and lead, but when you're a UI programmer, what was you? I'm guessing it wasn't junior. Was it mid or senior?
I would have been a senior.
It would have been a senior.
Yeah.
And is that something that is made apparent? When you're there, is it like senior UI programmer, or is it you're a senior and you have some more responsibilities? But as far as when you're referred to, you just refer to as a UI programmer. How does that work within Arrowhead? I know some organizations, like you go on teams, or it will be like this person's a mid, X programmer. This one's a junior X programmer.
Yeah, well, Arrowhead's a very flat hierarchy in terms of even if people might have something in the title, we don't usually refer to titles at any time. It's just not something we care about. Everyone is can talk to anyone at any time. There's no anyone can go talk to the CEO if they want. They can just knock on his door and have a chat with him. It's super, super flat, non hierarchical.
Okay. And you mentioned that above senior, you get into principal and lead. Principal being a bit more, technology focused. So I'm guessing it's like senior, but a bit more senior, effectively, a bit more higher level than that. But you're still in the nitty gritty of things. Lead, a bit more hands off and a bit more project management. What's the sort of percentage split? As a lead programmer, how much of that is, obviously people work management, and how much of it is actually doing code?
It varies. When I first became a lead, it was about 30-70 in favor of coding. And then as time went on, the more and more of the management started to take over, particularly as I went from being a lead of the UI code team to being lead of the entire gameplay code team. So as my number of direct reports grew and grew, so did my amount of free time for coding fall. And now it is about, at the moment, about 90-10. So 90% management, 10% coding.
Okay, 9% management, 10% coding. Okay, so that's interesting there because you're pretty much predominantly not doing coding then. So that 10% coding, what are you doing? And how do you make sure that what you are focusing that 10% time on? Because last thing you want to do is some menial task that a junior fresh out of university could do. It needs to be something that really only you or maybe a senior could do, but maybe they're busy, for example. How do you make sure that you're doing that right role? And is it is there ever any discussion of is it worth it? Like, is it worth just you going all the way to 100%? Management.
This is a question that comes up a lot at the organization. There is there is a push internally to split leads into people who are dedicated managers and people who are dedicated principals, so that the lead principal split becomes a manager principal split. So it wouldn't surprise me if that happens at some point. But in terms of how do you decide on what to work on? Well, I guess because I have visibility over all of the work, all 2,000 tickets in the system, and I'm constantly prioritizing them and assigning them out, I will sometimes know if there's something that needs my direct attention. And so, for example, it came up that we needed to do some changes to the microtransaction system. Now, the reason why I was probably the perfect person to do those is because one, I wrote it from the start, and two, it's a high risk thing for if it goes badly. We don't want to mess around with people's money. So yeah, that became a very obvious choice of, yep, I'm going to stop doing managementy things for a few hours and take on those tasks to make sure they're done like absolutely perfectly.
Okay, and you mentioned that you'll be managing like 2,000 tickets at any given time. Sounds very busy. So how do you manage time and the tasks? Obviously, managing it for yourself and making sure that you're not allocating too much time focusing on one area that might not add too much value, but needs attention as well. But then also, you know, managing it for other people. And also, how do you choose the right person to assign it to? Because it ain't a matter of, okay, let's just assign it to Bob. He's a programmer. Let's give him 4 programming tasks.
Yeah, so I have to work quite closely with the production team to decide on which things are the highest priorities, and the direction team as well. It becomes, I guess, a negotiation between leadership, direction, and production to decide on how we're going to split energy between things like fixing bugs, adding new features, adding new content. It all has to be weighed up and compared against each other. Sometimes there are bugs that are absolutely critical. Maybe it crashes the game for half of the player base. So, yep, that will take priority straight away. And sometimes, if there's nothing like that, then maybe that gives a bit more breathing room to add another feature or to tidy up some content.
So, with something like 2,000 tickets, a lot of tickets, do you ever have to say, no, this ticket has been created, but it's just not worth our time? It's just so low value, either when you're close to a release, whether it's an update or whether it's the game release, or, we're totally just saying no to. Do you ever have to say that? And how do you handle that? And then also, linked to that, who's creating these tickets? Is it you creating them? Is it the programmers and the designers, or is it a separate manager?
So tickets come in from all over the place. Anyone at the company has the power to create one, and then they go through a triaging process where we decide the priority and if they're going to get done, and if they are going to get done, when they're going to get done. So a lot of them will come from our internal QA. So internal QA will look for bugs, and then we have external QA partners as well. Some of them are a part of Sony, and some of them are through third parties as well. So we get all kinds of bug reports through there, and then if there's say localization issues, there's a dedicated localization team that will be creating tickets for that. And then there's also player feedback. So player feedback all gets funneled through our player support and customer support team, and they will create tickets as well, detailing maybe bugs that players are encountering, or glitches, or maybe things that they just find annoying, or features that they really want. And so all of this gets funneled into this huge triaging process where we have to decide what it is we're going to do. And absolutely, sometimes we just have to throw things out. There's a limit to how much we can get done, and there's no way we'll ever solve all 2,000 tickets. And so it tends to be there'll be some things that are like minor visual glitches that affect someone very occasionally and disappear by themselves after a second. So it's like we could spend, you know, 2 days of programmer time trying to figure that out, or we just go, it's fine, we can live with it. And that happens much more than I'm always comfortable with, but it's kind of like the reality of the situation.
Yeah, it is. Because, like you said, you've only got X amount of time, X amount of money, and when there's so many other high value tasks, either related to the money side of it within the game, or real gameplay elements, you're like, okay, you know, time needs to get allocated for that. So the tickets that you say no to, do they just get deleted, or do you kind of archive them? And if you ever get to a period of time where things are running nicely, there's not the teams maybe not so busy, you start going into your older tickets that you decided not to do at that time, and then you start picking them up a little later on and going through them. Like, how does that work?
So there's two piles. There's the pile of never fix, and there's the pile of if we have time. And so, yeah, things that go into the never fix pile, they have to be waived and they have to be approved that we won't fix them. They don't always get approved. Sometimes someone will have an opinion that says, no, this is something that actually does have to get fixed for maybe for legal reasons or maybe for accessibility reasons uh, or something like that. And then other times, most of the time, they'll say, yep, that's fine. We can skip that.
So who's approving them? Like, who is saying yes, we can skip it, or we have to do it? Like, is there, so again, someone dedicated? Is it just the next person up, or is it, who's doing that?
You know what? I'm not entirely sure. I click the button and it goes and it disappears into the system. And I'm pretty sure it's someone from Sony who gives the final word.
Okay. And going back, when he was talking about the hierarchy, he said junior, mid, senior. After that, splits into two: principal and lead. Principal more tech focused, lead more managerial and people focused. And then you also, we spoke about that there is more of a push of making that clear divide. That okay, if you're lead, you are going to into pure management, and that could potentially be the future of it. If not, you are principal, where you are still, hands-on coding. Traditionally speaking, managers have a higher sort of position than most technical individuals in the company. So there's usually clearly that hierarchy of managers are above the tech people or the designers. For example, with principal and lead, with lead being more managerial focused, is the lead role seen as almost a higher role and with more sort of authority than principal, or does Arrowhead make sure that okay, it literally is a split after senior, and as principal on the sort of same level effectively is no higher in terms of authority and level than lead?
Yeah, we don't raise managers above principals. So technical and managerial competence is considered equal, and we don't distinguish it. And in fact, just in general, we don't really, apart from maybe some authority to make a decision here and there, uh, even just being a lead versus a senior, it's more of a sideways step in the career than it is a pure upward step. Like it's much more about
What
changing
you
your
want to
focus
do?
to to looking after people, which is considered just as valuable. And someone who's a senior programmer still adds tremendous value and probably in terms of code much more value than I add. So it's yeah, we don't get hung up on hierarchy or you have to do what I say because I outrank you. Everything is a collaboration and every all decisions are made by consensus.
uh, and that makes me think, is Helldivers 2 success partly due to that hierarchical structure or the lack thereof? And, it sounds like people's opinions will be considered valid and they will be, thought about, even if it is by someone that in another organization will be considered lower and would get ignored due to that, hierarchy. What's your opinion on that? Do you think part of how Diver's success, which I mean, the success is because it's a quality game. We know that. But like, is part of the quality that was produced at the end because of the way it's structured, the company?
Yeah, probably. Like I know there are some organizations where maybe people from quality assurance get treated like they're some kind of lower level than other people, or maybe artists get treated like they're lesser, or the customer support people get treated like they're lesser. But that's not how we do it. If you have an idea, if you have something to contribute, everyone's contributions are considered valuable. And yeah, I think that definitely comes through in the quality of the final product.
So, because you segued into lead, which is more managerial focused, what made you go more into that versus, staying more, technical? Is that something that you've always wanted to do? or is it something that you discovered that you was good at and that you enjoyed? And then also you mentioned that you had done some, managerial stuff in education. Was it previously? If you could expand on that as well.
Yeah, so my career journey was pretty weird and winding. In the period before I was working as a game developer, I was a leadership trainer. So I would take groups of engineers and take them through just like sort of like personal development type things, teaching them things about psychology, sociology, how to deal with conflict, and how to manage stakeholders, and all of this kind of stuff that is pretty important to being in a workplace, but not necessarily the same as the hard skills that they would teach you at university. And so with that background, it meant that I had a bit of a head start in terms of understanding like the role of leadership, and it was all very interesting. I got very interested in the different parts of psychology and sociology, and how to help motivate people, and how to help get get good at productivity out of people while also looking after them, and trying to find that nice balance between needs of the individual and needs of the company, and creating a healthy and a happy working environment. So I think I was just drawn to that because I do like people and I do like looking after people. It gives me a kind of internal joy to know that maybe someone was having a hard time with something. I can come along, I can listen to them. Sometimes I can get the right help from someone else, or maybe I can step in and help myself. But either way, I know I can like provide some value to people, and then that makes them happy, and then they're good workers, and then we get a good game. So it's a it's another angle to creating a really good product, and working more through other people than working directly yourself.
So, in your education background, you did do a technical degree. What made you get more, before you was at a studio like Arrowhead, doing programming and now lead programmer? What made you get into those sort of roles? Because you were still, working with engineers, so you're still technical in nature or linked to the technical side, but it was a bit different in terms of the leadership. What made you get into it, and how did you get into it as well? Because I'm sure there'll be people listening thinking that sounds interesting. I would like to do, not participate in leadership training, but give leadership training. Like, and how do do that? And like, how old was you? Because are you like 23 years old and they're saying, you know, teach leadership to our engineers, or is it a matter of okay, you're a bit older, you got a bit more experience, and did you have any experience prior to that working there, as an engineer?
Well, I probably have to go back quite a bit in my career journey to answer this one. So I studied software engineering. That's what my degree's in, and I did that straight out of high school. So by the time I was 21, I was working as a software engineer for corporate jobs in a little town called Perth in Western Australia. Uh, After maybe 7 years of working as a software developer, I needed a break. I actually had a total career burnout. It was like absolute exhaustion, and I'd pushed myself way too hard. So I took a break from programming completely, and I decided at that point I was never going to program again. It's about as realistic as saying I'm never going to drink again after a big night. So either way, I did take a nice big break from the programming, and I needed to find something else to do. And I did always enjoy teaching because I spent a lot of time as a student at university teaching other people for a little bit of extra cash on the side. And so I started tutoring as a bit of a full time business where I would just take students who are struggling and do one on one sessions with them, and help them get better. And so I think a lot of my interest in like how learning works kind of stems from there. And then I decided I needed something a bit more stable, and so I saw a job advertising for someone teaching leadership training at a place called Engineers Australia. And so they're a body that represents the interests of engineers in Australia. Surprise. And I'm like, you know what? I've done teaching before, and this learning designer role sounds like something I could figure out as I go along. And honestly, I had no idea what a learning designer did. So I had to just convince them that I was an enthusiastic and very interested person. I've probably pestered them like 5 or 6 times over the course of 6 months until they finally gave me the job. And then from there, I've learned how to be a learning designer very quickly. It was a rush, and got to start to work with these big groups of engineers and help design the courses for them and teach these weekend courses. And so I had to kind of learn leadership training just enough to stay ahead of the class, always one chapter ahead of the class, so that I could know what I was teaching them. But yeah, of course, I went really, really deep into it and tried to distill it into something that was much more focused and teachable in a shorter time. But that was, yeah, that's kind of like the grounding of it. And it was only after a couple of years of doing that, which I started to really crave coding again, because coding is it's addictive. It's a really dopamine hit. So then I thought, you know what? Why not do what I always wanted to do and actually get into a gaming job? I always wanted to do it from the start of my career, but back in Perth, where I grew up, there just wasn't any opportunities. So by that time I was in Melbourne, and Melbourne has a much bigger game scene than Perth, although it's still pretty small. And I was able to get that job at Electronic Arts, and that's where I kicked started my career into gaming, where I am now.
Okay, so EA, you said you was working on Need for Speed, No Limits. What specifically was you doing there again on
Well,
that
I was a
game?
software engineer, so I was at EA. You get classified basically in a level. So software engineer 2 is basically saying you're a mid-level software engineer, and software engineer 2 just has the responsibilities of doing any kind of code work. And for that game, it was a lot of UI work mostly.
Okay. And it seems like you've done a lot of UI work. Is that something that you just fell into, or that you really had a passion for, and you pushed to be into that? Because I know people that push to be into AI, programming or design, or into gameplay, or and then also UI as well. So what was the case for you?
Well, I've always been a generalist, and I actually like being a generalist because I just enjoy dabbling in lots of different things. But when I looked at my CV and my entire background in corporate programming, I tried to figure out what from this can I take and leverage to my advantage to get myself a game job. And it's like, well, I can't talk about gameplay programming because I don't have any gameplay programming experience. And then I did more research, and I found out that UI programmers, while they're quite sought after, it's not a particularly glamorous job, and so they don't always get a lot of people applying for these roles. And so that smelled like an opportunity to me. I figured, well, I can sell my existing like development experience, which often involved some UI work, as well as the rest of full stack development. I can take that and take the UI part and apply that to game development, and then that would give me a foot into a position that might not get a lot of applicants, and maybe they would look more sideways at the fact that I don't have a lot of like game industry specific experience, and it worked.
Okay. So it sounds like there's been a few moments, whilst I've been talking to you on this podcast, where the decisions that you made have been logical and they've been, pragmatic. Surprise, surprise, you're a coder that you're making pragmatic decisions, in your career. But I do know coders where it will be like, I just really want to do this, even though there might be something slightly better in terms of career progression, terms of remuneration or whatever it is, or their lifestyle that they could do. And like with UI programming, you saw that, okay, after research, it's not that sought after, it isn't glamorous as AI programmer, or gameplay programmer, or special effects, so something like that, which is a lot more sought after. So where does that come from? And how do you get the balance of, okay, I'm gonna go down this route because this is probably the best decision in terms of career progression and money, versus, okay, I want to do this because I really, really want to do this, but it might not be the best decision in terms of where I want to go, but I enjoy it.
Well, hmm, I think back to like growing up in a smaller town where there wasn't always a lot of opportunities, and then even being in Melbourne, and my mindset has developed to the point where you have to you have to make your own opportunities, and you never say no to something that gets you a step closer to your ultimate goal. And like when I started out on the game development journey, my ultimate goal was to be part of like a team that produced like the greatest game in the world. And well, I don't know. Maybe I've actually hit that already. That's a crazy thought. But on the steps along the way, I had to go from like, okay, I have to go from not being in the industry at all to getting something in the industry. So yeah, I focused on promoting the like what do you call them, cross industry skills that I had to just get my foot in. Because until you get your foot in, it's extremely difficult to do anything within the gaming industry. And so yeah, the pragmatism is all in service of like a higher goal, and I'm prepared to to do things that are not maybe the perfect job, as long as they're a job that gets me one step closer to where I ultimately want to be.
And what does that look like? Where you ultimately want to be. Where are we heading for Brendan? Mm, as you get towards the end of your career.
Ah, look, I never expected to be this far along in my path at this point. I thought I'd be grinding out quite a few more games and until I hit a massive one. But yeah, it's hard to know where to go next. But my kind of sights right now are set on direction, and so that could either be technical direction, which is interesting, or it could be game direction. And game direction is probably even more interesting.
Okay, so that's really, I guess maybe game director or something along those lines, or some sort of producer role within a game.
Yeah, I think game director would suit me quite well. It's a combination of all the leadership stuff, and then add in a whole lot of creativity, as well as understanding how to like organize a large group of people to work together. So it's like little bits of production, little bits of like understanding engineering, little bits of understanding game design, and kind of bring it all together and trying to influence the people around you to think that you've got a good idea and convince them all to work in one direction and work towards the same goal. So it sounds like a super challenging kind of role. I don't envy anyone who is in this position, but the result could be that you could create the game of your dreams.
Okay. And have you ever thought about going, indie and doing your own game, maybe forming a little studio with two or three friends or colleagues?
Yeah, absolutely. The thought crossed my mind, particularly when I was back in Australia and looking for opportunities, and there just wasn't much available. I because I was very set on my goals, I would have absolutely considered starting my own studio to take the next step in my career. As it was, I didn't need to because Arrowhead flew me over to the other side of the world, so that was awesome. But yeah, I was absolutely prepared to like go it alone and start from scratch and build it up, everything up, a studio from nothing.
Okay. And at Arrowhead now, the game's out, doing well. What are you doing, right now on Arrowhead? Is it a matter of just updates? Is it DLC? Is it some new hidden project?
Well, I can't necessarily talk about all the things that are going on, but know that we are focusing on Helldivers 2 almost exclusively.
Okay.
Everything is about getting that game to the state where it needs to be. I know everyone loves this game, and it is an awesome game, but my god, does it have some bugs and jank, and it needs a lot of love and polish. Let's not beat around the bush. Even though they make for some great and hilarious YouTube clips, there is some jank that is really annoying, like if you get disconnected in the middle of your match or if the game crashes. And so there's a big push at the moment. I am trying to get the crash rates down, trying to get it to be more stable, trying to get the game to be as it was intended.
Okay. So you're saying there's still work to be done. There's bugs and there's errors and there's problems, with it. Why has Helldivers 2 become so successful and so loved if there still are a lot of problems in the game when you see other games and any little problem, people just jump all over it and they just hate over it so much. I haven't really seen that with Helldivers, but like you said, there are bugs. People are posting about it. So why hasn't that happened with Helldivers 2, do you think?
I can only speculate, but I suspect it's because they're having so much fun that if they need to restart the match because the game crashed, maybe they're having so much fun that it kind of takes the edge off the frustration.
Okay, so like the quality of the game overall is really high. That any aspects of it that aren't quite up there, they're willing to overlook because it's a overall well made game.
Yeah, I think people are very forgiving of something that is a little bit imperfect if it's innovative and interesting and fun and it just hits the spot that they're looking for. Like it's much better to have an imperfect masterpiece than a perfect bland generic thing.
So, working with Sony, and like I said, Sony owns the IP. Sony published Helldivers 2, but also Helldivers 1. Why did it come out on Windows and not be exclusive for PlayStation? I know Sony is doing a more of a push into Windows, but like with their other titles, I guess this is more first party studios, but stuff like Last of Us and Uncharted, and Horizon, it is a matter of we'll have it on PlayStation like a year or two later, we'll port it over to PC. Whereas with this, it was made alongside it. You know, how did that decision come about?
All right, I'm going to get into a little bit of speculation here as well, but if you look back at Helldivers 1, Helldivers 1, I could be extremely wrong, but it's either the first or one of the first releases that Sony actually put on PC at all, and that was a big move for them. And I think there's perhaps an element of experimentation when it comes to Arrowhead because we're not a first party studio, because we're independent. Uh, Maybe they're using us more as a way to test these ideas to see how is it if we take a game and release it on PC. And turns out that Helldivers 1 was successful. It was niche, but it did make money, and it was by any metric it can be considered a success. Never had the same crazy player base. And then when you're releasing a game like this, I think it benefits hugely from having a large player base. So if you're going to make a live service game, the size of the player base makes a big difference. And so by doing cross-platform, it means you've doubled the chance that people are going to be able to find a match with someone else. So if you're restricted to only people on your own platform and there's only 5,000 people playing, then that's much worse than if you are cross-platform. There's 5,000 people on each platform. Now you have a pool of 10,000 people to make a match with. And as it was, we weren't expecting, the 700,000 plus people that we got. So maybe it wasn't necessary, but it's still good to have like a really big community, and we see the community as they get involved on Reddit and Discord. That a huge community can create like a kind of a magic of its own. And so yeah, it was always part of the DNA of Helldivers 2 to be cross-platform and to have that big community that was all fighting together in the same galactic war. So I think all of these factors combined is why Sony has chosen this title to be their first simultaneous PlayStation and PC release.
Yeah, because Sony definitely is a company where they're always a bit more hesitant about putting stuff on PC. The cross-platform nature of it, Microsoft has Windows. Like when you're playing games on PC, you are most likely playing them on Windows. Like, yeah, we've you got Steam Deck and Steam OS, and that is kind of making strides. But it is gonna. There's a very good chance if you say, "Oh, I'm a PC gamer," you probably can bet your life savings they're playing on Windows. Whereas if you just say you're a console gamer, you probably wouldn't want to bet, your life savings on PlayStation or Xbox or Switch. It's not so obvious. So, what was some of the technical considerations when doing it cross-platform on Windows and on, PlayStation 5 as well?
Ooh, okay. Well, some ones that might not be obvious is that the CPU architecture is not exactly the same on a PC versus a PlayStation, and that is most of the time a negligible difference that you don't care about. But like when we're doing things like our maps, as you know, are procedurally generated. There's a lot of math that goes into that, where you pick a random number, and then that random number starts the creation of literally everything. So by just iterating on that random number, you create the entire level. And that way, when you join a match, all you have to do is send someone else that same random number that started the whole level generation. And then, in theory, it will generate the exact same level. Now, that's where the practical problems can start to come in, because suddenly you start to find that maybe there's a CPU instruction on the two platforms that doesn't produce an identical result. And it could be a difference of like 0.0001, and maybe that's okay. But sometimes the difference can be quite large, and then suddenly you've got PlayStation users playing with PC users, and they're seeing different versions of the same map, which is kind of weird and not what we want. So that's one of the things you kind of have to look at. Another big thing is dealing with like all of the social aspects of the game. Because we're not on Steam and we're not on PSN, but we're on both, we have to communicate between those two platforms, and we can't rely on, say, other games can just rely on, if they're on PC only, they can use all of the Steam infrastructure. So if you want to have a friends list, you can just rely on the Steam's friend list. And if you're on PlayStation only, then you can rely on the PlayStation's friend list. But because we're doing this crossplay thing, we actually have to manage our own friendship system in between these two platforms that has to talk to both of them and help to connect people to across the different across the divide. And it's a lot of extra coding work on the back end to support all of that.
Okay. And with, it being cross-platform, how many, users are more on PC, or how many are on, PlayStation? Is it more popular on PlayStation, or is it more popular on PC?
That's one of the few details that I'm not allowed to divulge.
Okay, fair enough. I'm guessing that's obviously, a sales sort of issue. With the, the different platforms, can you say you only want to play with PC players or console players, or are you stuck with whoever are given?
Oh, we have a switch in the settings that you can change if you want to turn off crossplay. So you're absolutely free to play with only people on your own platform.
Okay. How popular is that Switch with people? Like, do you see that a lot of people prefer just to play with their own systems?
You know what? I haven't looked at the metrics for that, but I could get back to you next week if you want.
Yeah, I would just love to, hear about the metrics of that. Are people appreciating this cross-platform, but then, deciding for the most part that they want to stick with console gaming? Because again, there is that thing, the PC master race. A good PC player with, a crazy, keyboard and mouse setup, maybe something custom with some other scripts in Windows that are doing stuff like you can really, level up your gameplay versus on consoles. And I know you get elite controllers now on console that have customizable buttons and adjustable sensitivity on the joysticks, but it's still not the same level as a keyboard and mouse. And then vice versa, a PC player might say, I don't want to play with console, I want to play with PC. So I would just be interested, generally speaking, of the divide between the two.
Yeah, anecdotally, I will say that we don't hear a lot of people disabling the crossplay feature, and it's because we're not competitive. We're not a PvP game.
Yeah.
It's all friends. So if you're a console player and you're playing with a PC player and they've got a more precise, fast aim because they're using a mouse, that is not to your detriment. That's to your benefit because you're on the same team.
Okay. And what's your preferred platform of choice?
I play on PC. I love my PC. And when you're a game dev, you need to have a pretty beefy PC because you're often playing the game like in its debuggable mode, and its debuggable mode is not optimized.
I
So
know.
to be able to do that, yeah, you need something pretty chunky. And yeah, it's my PC is a workhorse. But believe it or not, I still play it with a PlayStation controller.
Okay, so what's that choice to play with a PlayStation controller? As in, do you just love playing with controllers, or do you love console gaming, but you are playing on PC, so you take over that experience? Because, yeah, probably 10, 15 years ago, or even more, it wasn't that practical to play PC games with a controller because a lot of them didn't support it. Whereas now, virtually every new game has native, controller support. And usually, when you connect it, it'll show you the actual correct buttons, that are on your controller, potentially even, with Xbox as well. And again, that's another question, after the previous one. If I connect a Xbox controller, what does the UI look like? Does it just look like the PlayStation UI, or does it look more, relevant to my Xbox controller AB, for example?
So we were very careful with the UI. Anytime you switch your controller, if you say are in a menu and you move the mouse, then it will show you all of the different options with the keyboard and mouse keys. But if you say touch the joystick on the controller, it will suddenly switch everything to show you like press X for this thing, press Y for this thing. And even if you switch between two different controllers, if I switch from my Xbox controller to my PlayStation controller, all of the callouts will update to match whatever controller I'm using. So yeah, we're pretty slick in that department most of the time. It works in 99% of places, but I'm sure QA will prove me wrong. But yeah, why do I like it? It's an interesting question. I know, like if I'm playing a really like high paced twitchy game, like I love Doom Eternal, for example. I'll actually play that with the keyboard and mouse because I need that super fast aim time, and I'm playing it on a very high difficulty. But for most other games, I actually prefer to get out of the mode of using a keyboard and mouse, partly because it tends to put a bit of a strain on my old body, like my shoulder starts to hurt after a while, and also because it just feels a bit like work when you're touching a keyboard and a mouse all day. So to actually pick up a controller puts me in the mindset of like I'm not working now. I'm actually just like goofing off and having fun and playing games.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Yeah, if you are touching a keyboard and mouse, and also I find that if you're sitting on a desk all day at a computer playing games in that sort of format versus sitting on a sofa on a larger TV, and even if your PC is connected to it, but you've got a controller, does feel different. And again, what's your preferred choice? Because you're using a controller with a PC, are you still sitting at your desk with like a monitor, or are you sitting like on a sofa with a TV?
I have both options. So I've got some decent screens attached to my computer, but it's also has a very long HDMI cable that will connect it all the way to the big TV. And it will just depend if someone else is using the TV, then I'm quite happy to sit on the at my desk. But yeah, I quite like the couch. The couch again takes you away from that feeling of being at work and puts you much more in that headspace of just chilling.
Okay, and actually, one question I forgot to ask about Arrowhead and Helldivers. What's the main programming language that's used for the engine and the game?
So the game is written in C++. We don't use any scripting languages on top of that. The
Okay,
actual backend is written in C sharp.
okay, so the back end, as in like the network side, you mean,
Yeah,
or
the online servers. So the parts of the game that control, say, matchmaking and keeping track of your inventory and all of the major orders and the state of the galactic war. All of that is handled in the cloud on some cloud servers, and that's written in C sharp.
okay, and any particular reason? Because scripting is taking the industry by storm. That a lot of companies are jumping onto that. Why have an Arrowhead? Is it again that thing of it was development was started 8 years ago when things were a bit different compared to how they are now, or is it more okay? We're going to keep it old school, keep it C++, keep it that C style of nature.
What's interesting is the previous Arrowhead games were heavily into the scripting. We used Lua, which has pretty good support in Stingray, and almost all of say the Showdown Effect and Helldivers One is Lua based. And then we decided to move away from that. We decided to go back to a much more pure C++ way of coding for a few reasons. It is one a little bit more efficient in terms of you get better performance out of it. It's even if it is less efficient to actually write the code. But then the efficiencies that you gain in writing your code through scripting sometimes get erased by the difficulty that you have in maintaining it. So when you have everything written in C or C++, it is trivial to tell if you've broken something. If I make a mistake in my code, it won't even compile. So I know straight away, yep, I've made an error. If you're using a scripting language, sometimes you don't know until you actually boot up the game and run it, and it hits that part of your code, and maybe you've got a typo, and you won't even know you've got a typo until it's running. And that makes it a lot harder to maintain it sometimes. It's very easy to create problems without realizing it.
Okay, and have you thought about, or has the studio thought about using something like TypeScript? Instead of something like JavaScript or Lua, where they do have those issues, where things aren't compiled and you don't see the errors. Until the end, until you actually hit the error in there, and then as a result, you might miss it. There might be a niche scenario where it gets triggered, and you might not trigger that niche scenario was testing it. Whereas with C++ or C, a lot of the time it just won't compile. So have you thought about something like TypeScript instead?
No, TypeScript or JavaScript or any of the other scripting languages just wouldn't be efficient enough. One of the nice things about Lua is that once it's uh, once it's compiled with its just-in-time compiler, it compiles down to bytecode, which means that you can get it to run at almost the same speed as C and C++. The virtual machine's very simple, and it's very efficient. And this is in stark contrast to something like JavaScript, where it's even with all the advances they've made with getting, say, the G8 compilers to like compile that down to like very, very efficient code. Even with all of that, it's never going to be in the same league as something like Lua, which is like much closer to C performance.
Okay, and throughout this decade plus long career of yours, where going through education, programming, now lead programmer, obviously Arrowhead working on the immensely successful Helldivers 2 game. What advice would you give to someone that's early on in the career or just at university and they're listening to this episode and thinking, I want to do something like that. I want to go, through programming. I want to get into a more leadership role, and then eventually go into more of that top, director role. That's the path that I really want to take. What advice, tips, and tricks would you give to someone that's really practical and actionable?
For a start, don't say no to any opportunity. If you get an opportunity, you take it, even if it's not perfect. If it puts you even one step closer to where you want to be, it's worth it. There's nothing worse than spending time doing nothing when you could have been like learning skills that are, if not exactly what you want, maybe they're adjacent to it and maybe they're transferable. So you have to chase and make your own opportunities, and you have to take anything that you can get. There's no point holding out like I've heard stories of people who they really wanted to make console games, and then they get out of uni and they go, "Oh, I've been offered a position to make mobile games, but I don't want to make mobile games. Mobile games isn't interesting to me." And then they don't take that job. But how they're going to break into the industry? It's they're shooting themselves in the foot by being too picky about what they take.
Yeah,
So you have to just take anything you can get. And then the second thing is just to, I would say, always try to be the thing that you're reaching for. So don't wait to be told you're a senior. Watch what the seniors do and then do those things. Take initiative, be proactive, and don't wait to be told like what to do. Don't wait for a title before you start acting like you have the title. If you want to be a leader, being a leader might be a title, but being a leader is in reality it's much more of a mindset. It's a way you approach things, it's a way you approach people. It's like you can be given authority through a title, and that's fine, but true authority comes from the respect that you get from people who appreciate the things that you do for them.
so from that, there's a couple of questions I've got. First of all, how do you make sure you get noticed? So, you said, if you, like I said before, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. So if you do want a more leadership senior role, start looking at what they're doing within that organization, especially because that's what's important. And, start doing those things. But then how do you make sure that you are doing them, but then getting noticed as well? Because you can't just be saying to your manager or whoever, be like, look what I'm doing a senior task or what a senior would do, look at me. But then vice versa, you don't want them to not notice you at all and not take you for granted and then overlook you when that time comes that they do need a leadership role and they don't consider you. So how do you make sure you get noticed in the right way?
That's interesting. So, in terms of if you're going for not for a leadership role, but you're trying to upgrade from a junior to a mid or from a mid to a senior, then the quality of your code will be noticed. It's not like you have to promote that. You will the things that you do will be seen by other people. And if you have any kind of decent code reviewing system, and if your manager is looking at your code, then you don't have to worry about that. That will be noticed by everyone. But then it's also important to engage in a little bit of self promotion. So if you do something cool and you have a Slack channel where you can share stuff, just share it. Like even if it's not something you did at work. So For example, my wife is an artist, and so sometimes she'll do some really cool drawings, and she'll just post them because, hey, check it out! Look what I did in my spare time. This is really fun. It's just like it's not a boast. It's sharing. And same with code. If you write some really cool little widget and it has this cool new feature that adds to the game, even if it doesn't even end up in the game, even if you just wrote it for fun, just sharing it and like generating excitement and hype and positive feedback goes a long way. If you're trying to go for a more leadership role, then you also don't really need to promote that because the more you help people, people remember when you help them. And the more you look after people, people will remember that you're looking after them, and people will talk, especially in the like higher echelons of a company. They notice, and you don't really have to go out of your way to get noticed. If you're consistently like showing up, being helpful, being useful, making good decisions, making the people around you feel good, and getting shit done, then you really don't have much to worry about. But yeah, be by all means like any chance that you get to just show off something cool, do it, especially if it's like really low key casual in like your internal messaging system.
Yeah, I mean, there's always that balance of how do I, but yeah, because you are showing off. Like, how do you show off about it without it becoming too much? Like, everything. Like, if you're doing something every day, that's a little different or a little cool. Like, how do we make sure that it doesn't become overbearing and too much? And then somebody tells you, that's a bit too much. 'Cause that's the last thing that you want, and yeah, and making it tasteful as well. And then trying to do it in a way, I guess where people are like, oh, that's cool that you've done that. That actually adds value. It's good to know that you've done that now.
Yeah, if you're doing really good stuff, you can't smash them out really quickly because good art and good code takes time. So I don't think if you're actually aiming to produce really cool, interesting things that you're really going to have much trouble. It's if you were to start, say, pumping out a bunch of low effort, maybe AI generated art. No one wants to see that or pay attention to it because I mean anyone can do it and anyone can just generate a ton of it with very little effort. So if you are producing high value things, it's fine because it will take you a while between each one. And also monitor the temperature of the channels. Like there's probably a dedicated space or a dedicated channel within your organization. You can see how often other people are posting. You probably don't want to post two things in a row. If other people are posting and you haven't done one for a while, then yeah, it's fine. And you can take the temperature by looking at the reacts. So maybe in Slack you can see how many emojis that you get. If you're not sure whether or not people appreciate what you're doing, just start to see the little happy smileys and the emojis and the fire symbols start to fall off. That's when you know that maybe you should back off.
I think that's a good tip. If the interaction that you get in is slowing down and the type of interaction is changing, then maybe you need to either vary what you're doing or reduce, or maybe up the quality of what you're doing, and then inevitably that reduces the quantity as well.
Yes, and always go into it with the mindset of like sharing cool things that you're happy with instead of trying to self promote. It's a very different mindset, and as long as you keep that mindset of like yeah of openness and sharing and collaborating instead of like look at me, I'm so awesome. Like if you can find that right balance, you'll be fine.
So you mentioned about taking any opportunity that you have for getting closer to your goals. How do you judge an opportunity, uh, and making sure that okay, you've judged it correctly and it is something that could get me closer to my goal versus okay, it's an opportunity, but realistically, it's probably not going to really get me much closer to my goals.
Well, I guess you have to look at where you are now. So if where you are now is outside the industry, then getting in the industry is your first priority.
Mhm.
So anything in the industry is a good pick. Once you're in the industry, now you can start to decide, okay, am I on the platform that I want? Maybe I'm on mobile and I want to go to PC. Okay, your next role needs to have PC in it. Or maybe you've got multiple avenues for it. Maybe what you're doing is too small of a team, like you're indie, but you want AAA. So that's a jump that can add value. And you need to just decide, like, all right, if you know exactly where you're going, then you know the difference between where you are now and the next role, and you can see is all of the things that I'm doing in that role closer aligned to the thing that I finally want to be doing. You could look at, say, the jump I made from Electronic Arts to a little company called Zero Latency. Zero Latency runs these VR, I suppose, what do you call them, like VR warehouses where 8 people will chuck on their VR helmets and run around and shoot each other in these like shared spaces in virtual reality. It's pretty cool. And for me to make the choice to go there from EA, it came down to the fact that I wasn't that interested in mobile, and these guys were doing cool stuff with Unreal Engine and C++ and and VR. And so for me, that was closer to my end goal, which was to be in PC console. And the fact that they had that engine was like, right, if I can get experience in that engine, then I am more likely to get what I really want on PC and console.
Okay. And you said that you had done software engineering at university. Would you recommend university to people? I know it's a little while ago, so obviously a lot has changed, and there's a lot of different courses within IT and the technical field now. So it isn't you don't have to go as simple as software engineering or computer science. You can go a bit more niche. Like there's loads of games courses now, and games with art or programming or a mixture, or I'm even seeing courses at some universities like in America where they're teaching about esports as well. Like there's like all sorts of crazy courses. But what is it something that you would recommend, and how important is it to getting into the industry? Because you when you hear a lot of people, they'll say, yeah, it's not that important. You just need the experience. But again, getting experience is difficult. When you're trying to become a junior out of university, it's a lot easier because like, okay, you've got a degree in computer science. It's at a decent university. You got a decent grade. We'll give you a chance. Versus,
Yeah,
I haven't
I
done
think
anything yet, and I'm just done a bit at home.
I think you need to like look at yourself, really look deep into yourself, and ask yourself what your strengths are. So if you're the kind of person that thrives in a formal education environment, then you can't go wrong with uni. You will learn like so much really good theory. You will get to practice your theory, and you will be put with a bunch of like-minded people. And particularly like even if it's a non-games course, I found that everything was relevant. We still did stuff with 3D vector math, and we still did all of the fancy coding techniques. We looked at memory safety and all of the stuff that's still very applicable. In fact, I don't think there was a single part of that course that really went to waste. Uh, but if you are not that sort of person, if you actually hate formal learning environments, then don't force yourself to go through that. Like, I wouldn't bother necessarily with the online like courses that you can do. I would get into modding. If you want to be a coder, you can do it through teaching yourself and then creating mods because your portfolio will get you so far. If you have a portfolio that says, look at this amazing mod that I made for whatever your favorite game is, and it's got tons of players and you're proud of it and you can show people and other people can recognize that it's good quality, then that's enough. I was just chatting to a friend today and that was his path in, and he has been very successful and he's one of the best coders that I know.
So going down like that modern route, uh, because you mentioned something important there, like if it's got loads of players, is the important part there? Does it have recognition, and therefore the players and people are like, okay, it must like the recruiter or the studio be like, it must be good, be kind of because it's got a lot of players. Like, is that a very important part, or is it a minor part of it? Because again, the one of the things I want for people listening to not just this episode of the podcast, but any episode, is I want them to get actual real life stories, actual real life advice of, this probably isn't as important or this is important. So, what's your opinion on that, and in terms of what you may have seen with that other guy as well?
Okay, so with my mate, was he's made his mods very niche. So it was for a very hardcore player base. And by sticking to that niche and really nailing it, it didn't have a huge player base, but the quality was really high. And that I think is probably more important than the player base. If the quality is high and it serves its niche really well, then that's a kind of a level of success that is like highly recognizable to someone who's looking at your portfolio. Player counts that are high are also a good indicator that whatever you've done is like scratching in the itch for a lot of people, but it's not everything.
What game, was that friend of yours modding for?
You know what? I have no idea.
Fair enough. And this is pretty much it for the end of this episode. I mean, this week's episode of FireDev. But what I do at the end is a set of rapid fire, fun questions. A little lighthearted to tone it down. Are you ready for them, Brendan?
All right, shoot me.
Okay, if you was to run your own studio, would you rather run a 10-person studio or a 1,000-person studio, and why? Obviously, at something like Arrowhead, it's a lot larger than 10. But if you was to run your own and head it up, what would you be your preference?
10 people.
Okay,
Yep.
why?
Smaller means that you have much more influence over everything that happens, and you can be involved in all kinds of parts of it. And as a generalist, I really like having my hands in all the different pies and getting involved in all the decisions and working very closely with a tight knit group of people, where it's much easier to all stay aligned and to work together. You reduce the channel, you reduce the amount of communication channels that you have to manage, and it's a pretty fun time. It feels more like a game jam.
Okay, and if you had a choice, would you rather you're in Sweden right now? Is that correct?
That's right.
Do they have euros as their currency?
No, we use Corona.
Okay, I'll go buy American dollars just to because I'm not 100% sure of the exchange rate. So, would you rather have 5 million US dollars up front or 500,000 a year for the rest of your life, and why?
Ooh. I'm getting a bit old, so I reckon I haven't got that many years left. I'd probably take the upfront.
Okay, fair enough. Favorite board game, favorite movie, and favorite video game.
Or video game. I've got a few. I'm pretty torn between, say, Doom Eternal, Deep Rock Galactic, my own game, surprisingly, Helldivers 2.
It's a
Uh,
good game.
yeah, it's
It's
not
not a
bad.
bad game where you're liking it because you worked on it, but it's actually not that good. But it's a good one, so it's a good choice.
Yeah, yeah. Board games. What do I like? I really like that silly one where you play the sushi game. I can't remember what it's called, but you're basically passing cards around trying to create sushi trains.
Okay, I
Uh,
haven't heard. I don't think I've heard of that one. I'll have a quick Google. I'm sure if I put sushi board game cards, it'll come up.
yeah. And what was the last one?
Favorite movie?
Ooh, it could be Terminator, the first one,
Okay, the OG.
the OG, yeah, or maybe Braveheart. I don't know. It's hard to pick one. The Matrix was very formative. I think I saw that as a kid.
The first one, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. I've
what
always
did you
been
think of
like
the
a
most recent
sci-fi
one?
nerd. Sorry,
Or I was just saying, what did you think of the most recent Matrix, that new one that came out?
no comment.
Yeah, I think that says it all. Then, what video game are you looking forward to the most?
Oh, I tell you what, I've been so tunnel visioned in what I'm doing at the company that I'm barely even aware of what's coming. I'm very curious to see how Dragon's Dogma 2 turns out. I'm looking forward to that, and I do want to get my hands on Final Fantasy VII, both the original remake that was at Rebirth and the new one that's just come out, because I was a big Final Fantasy VII lover and back in the day, and I think it's about time I get my hands on the ports.
Final question, two-parter. Does money buy you happiness, and what does a good life mean to you?
Money does not buy happiness, but it does solve a lot of problems. Uh, a good life, a good life is getting to work with people who you really like on a project that you care about, and then sharing your life with more good people when you get home, and being comfortable enough that you don't have to stress. So, like, money's not everything, but you need to have just enough to make sure that you're you're not worrying about it.
Okay. So that's the end of our podcast today, Brendan. I want to thank you so much for coming on. It's really informative for me. I'm sure it will be for the audience to hear from, one of the lead programmers at Arrowhead. So thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone for listening to this week's episode of FireDev. If you liked it, obviously give a comment. And I'll see everyone in next week's episode. Thank you very much and see you soon. Bye.